This week at the agenda, we recharge the energy debate, we examine why women aren't equitably represented in the media, and consider the role of luck in our individual success. The Agenda's Week in Review begins with Liesl Gerntholz from Human Rights Watch on the progress women have made in the political sphere. Here's a chart showing a number of different countries and the percentage of women's participation in politics. And, you know, nobody would get this if you asked what's the country in the world where more women participate in the legislative affairs of the country than any other. Rwanda, number 1. Andorra, number 2. Cuba, number 3, nearly half. Sweden, number 4. The Seychelles, number 5, still just almost half the participation. Finland comes in at 6. South Africa, there's your native land, at number 7, 42%. Where's Canada? We are well down the list. 25% rather, of our parliamentarians are female. And the United States is even worse. 17% of their congressional representatives are female. You did point out that there are a couple of countries in the world, I guess, where, or I should say 17 countries out of about 200, I think is the last chart, where the woman is either head of government or head of state or both. But when you look at those numbers, what do you infer?
I infer that progress has been made because I think if you go back 50 or 60 years, you would have seen no woman in parliaments as heads of government in any kind of key leadership positions across both public and private sectors. So I think, well, firstly, I think if you care about women's rights, you have to play the long game. It's incremental changes. It doesn't happen overnight. So in some respects, I look at those figures and I feel incredibly optimistic that change is unstoppable, that we will continue to see the number of women increasing in Parliament as leaders of government. But I do think it's very significant that those top 5 countries are largely in the developing world. Because I think in this respect, it's been the developing world that has perhaps led the charge to put more women in those positions, and that many of the developed world that we have looked upon to play a leadership role in women's rights have not kept pace with some of the progress that has been made.
Don't you find that odd? I mean, we in the West think we're so superior in so many ways to the developing world, but look how far ahead they are on this scale. It really is something, isn't it?
Well, I think we're looking at a very particular aspect of the problem, because I think in terms of women's political participation, Beijing, one of the things that came out of Beijing was a suggestion that quotas and a 33%, they called it a critical mass, was used. And of course, you had a lot of transition happening in places like Africa and Asia at the time. So there was space, you know, there were new governments forming, there were changes to electoral systems. So in some respects, those places had an opportunity to look at the recommendations coming out of Beijing and try to figure out how to implement them. You know, in places like the US and Canada, you have electoral systems that are really, in some respects, cast in stone. Very little changes happen to them. And I think in those places it's more difficult. But I think the barriers that women face, both in the West and in the developing countries, are often quite similar.
Do you think we need something in, since I'll pick on the 2 countries lowest on that list that we published there, do we need something in Canada or the United States which mandates a floor for female participation in politics?
You know, I would argue yes, because I think the figures speak for themselves. In both countries where you have high levels of educated women, where progress has been made in terms of getting women into universities, into non-traditional employment, the fact that you still have very low levels of women in politics, I think speaks to some of the barriers that women face in making it in politics.
By many accounts, Canada is a leader when it comes to lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender rights. But in many parts of the world, being gay is a crime. Gays and lesbians find themselves confronted by human rights abuses and constant threats. And in some countries, being gay is punishable by death. Here now to tell us about the fight to have LGBT rights recognized on a global stage, Boris Dietrich. He is Advocacy Director of the Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender Rights Program at Human Rights Watch, and we're very happy to have you here at TVO tonight.
My pleasure.
We had an incident not too long ago in Canada, and I want to find out if it really had impact. The Minister of Foreign Affairs for Canada gave a speech recently where he criticized some African countries, some Caribbean countries, which were in the Commonwealth, saying that their record on gay and lesbian rights was not good. Too many abuses, too many violations of human rights, and he called them out, these countries, for doing so. Do you think statements like that by a Canadian politician have any influence at all?
Unfortunately, sometimes they might even have a negative influence. And of course, the minister is right in what he says, but the question is sometimes silent diplomacy behind the scenes, working behind the scenes, putting pressure on governments might have more effect than publicly denouncing policies and laws, because people might get offended. In this case, this happened at the conference of the Inter-Parliamentary Union. I've been a member of it myself, so I know exactly how those meetings go. And the Speaker of the House of Uganda felt offended. She went back to Uganda, and now the anti-homosexuality bill has been reintroduced in Parliament and will be discussed. So in this case,
there was a connection between those two things?
Yes, because she was in Canada, and she actually said to the minister in this meeting, we are not a colony of Canada, and she was really quite aggressive, to use that term. She came back to Uganda, and very heroically people praised her for standing up against Canada and the West. Because a lot of countries, they pretend that homosexuality is a Western thing, and that Western countries are imposing their values on countries like Uganda, which is of course not the case, but they use that as a pretext. So sometimes we have to be very mindful when and in what circumstances we really address these issues.
We are taught to believe that reward and merit are closely aligned, that many of our politicians and business leaders are where they are because of their abilities. But our next guest argues that if we properly consider the role of luck, that could change the way we think about our democracy. Here's Mark Kingwell, philosopher at the University of Toronto, and very happy to welcome you back to that chair.
Thank you. Glad to be back.
As you saw in the opening clips, I want to start with that summer of love at the Republican National Convention, where they considered this issue of whether you built it or you didn't build it. Well, let me just go back over this. Here's what Barack Obama said on the hustings July 13th in Virginia. He says, if you were successful, somebody along the line gave you some help. There was a great teacher somewhere in your life. Somebody helped to create this unbelievable American system that we have that allowed you to thrive. Somebody invested in the roads and bridges. If you've got a business, you didn't build that. Now, his syntax may not have been good, but
And the quote shouldn't really end there.
It shouldn't.
He goes on to talk about infrastructure and currency and all the other things that make business possible.
Exactly. So what the president meant to say was, I think we get the idea that what he meant when he said you didn't build it, he wasn't referring to your business, he was referring to the education that your teacher got, or the roads or the bridges and all of that kind of stuff. Yeah. Is it, just taking a step back, is this either or setup a useful way to view success in your view?
It's really not useful, but you can see why it's inevitable, because the fallout after Obama's comment was in some ways the most interesting moment of the entire campaign, because you had a first principles debate going on about the nature of American democracy, and if you want to extrapolate, about democracy more generally and about politics more generally. So you have these two visions which are now competing and probably at this point mutually exclusive. One is the one that is driven by individualism and by tight connection between perceived effort and perceived outcome.
So I did it all myself, you didn't help me, it's my hard work, sweat equity, pulling my socks
Right.
up, all that.
And therefore, taxation is redistributive rather than distributive. Tax freedom day and so on. Government is taking what is mine and giving it to somebody else. And on the other side, you have a vision which is very familiar to Western European democracies, parts of a Canadian democracy, you might argue, which is not socialist, but socialized. And that's to say that we understand that there are public trusts that make individual lives in their particular contours possible, that there are things that are held in common and built in common, and that we depend upon others, even if it's just as the people who populate the markets that we try to colonize with our products and services, we depend upon others for whatever comes our way. So, of course, neither of them is the whole picture, and that's where I think this becomes interesting.
Neither is the whole picture, but I get the sense just from listening to you and reading your stuff that you're closer to the latter than the former.
I am, partly because the individualistic vision, the one that's been driven by this tight connection between effort and outcome, has come so to dominate the world, especially in the form of economic thinking, contract thinking, that it's become a dangerous force. And one of the ways to counter that is to try to chip away at the presumptions of that view, precisely at the level of first principles. What does it mean to be an individual? What does it mean to have what we call success? What are the actual factors that go into somebody being wealthier or more powerful than somebody else?
Okay, but you also hear things like, if I was successful, I did it all myself, and if I failed, well, it wasn't my fault. Right. The deck was stacked, right? You hear that a lot, right?
Sure. So there, I mean, we all do these kind of double standards within our own confused thinking about this. You know, there are lots of jokes around this kind of faulty psychology. One is, you know, the best piece of work I ever did was being born into the right family. You know, the smartest decision I ever made.
Picking my parents.
Right. Or the old joke about George W. Bush that he was born on third base and thought he'd hit a triple. You know, these kinds of things try to highlight the idea that many of the strongest factors that determine outcome in terms of personal happiness, personal wealth, or success are really already decided at the moment of birth. So the birthright lottery, as it's sometimes called, is probably the single most important feature of human existence. And yet, for the most part, we don't pay attention to it. So then we get into this kind of doubling where we say, I did that through my own effort, that's mine, but I failed because of politics, or, you know, somebody at work hates me, or just, you know, the breaks didn't come my way. But if there's luck, which there is, it goes both ways.
Why do you think it's important to consider this relationship between luck and success?
I think the most important thing is just to give us, those of us who are blessed, who come out on the top side of the birthright lottery, a sense of how contingent and fragile our current happiness is, which in turn might confer upon us a greater awareness of the responsibilities we have to the whole system that made that possible, and to those people who are on the downside of the lottery. So just take Canada. To be a Canadian, to be born a Canadian, in global terms, is a winner. But to be born, say, in Nunavut, is to be, within Canadian terms, possibly a loser in that lottery within the lottery. And there are all kinds of things that have to be considered when you think about the uneven distribution of opportunities or breaks, not just goods and services. And then you can start to compensate for some of them, not all. You know, there's an important difference between luck, which is an injustice, and luck, which is a mere misfortune. You know, on the injustice side, you could actually have policies that would try to work against the uneven distribution of injustice. When it comes to misfortune, the best you can probably do is relief. But think about what happened to, you know, the eastern seaboard of the United States during Sandy. Very bad luck, you know, the so-called act of God. Is that an injustice? No, not exactly. That's not something that government policy could have prevented or ameliorated. Now it can only be relieved. So you can make that kind of decision even within the realm of luck.
I'm going to follow up on that again in a second, but just before we go there, do we need to believe in the mythology that anyone can be a success provided you work hard enough?
Well, in my view, that's one of the most dangerous pieces of nonsense that's out there.
And yet we hear that all the time. Yeah. I mean, we're taught that from kindergarten and up.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
you're not buying it.
I'm not buying it. I understand where it comes from, because it's that idea that you want to encourage effort. No one wants to discourage effort. You know, it's the Homer Simpson view. You know, try and fail. Why bother trying again? You want people to believe, everyone, especially the young, I think, that they need to work hard to maximize their opportunities. But the idea that hard work alone will trump your original distribution of opportunities is a myth. And it's a dangerous myth if it covers over the fact that those opportunities were themselves unevenly distributed.
So we want to prick that balloon?
I do.
You do?
Yeah.
If you consider the role luck has played in making the affluent wealthy, you may reconsider how much tax they should be paying. Now, this cognitive framing, how does it play into how we react on the issue of taxation, or more particularly tax increases?
Well, I think if you're aware of the fact that without a very well-developed infrastructure all around you, no matter how talented you were, no matter how hard you worked, you wouldn't generate much material success in life. If you're really aware of that, then I think your whole cognitive frame colors a very different emotional reaction to the idea of the government seizing your money by force, which is how many conservatives like to think of it. No, unless we all contribute, and it's necessarily by force, nobody would pay voluntary taxes. then I think we don't have the kind of system that enables people who work hard and are talented to generate a lot of wealth. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Nepal many years ago, and I had a cook who worked for me who was probably the very most talented person I've ever met before or since, and yet he'll never earn more than a bare subsistence level of income, because Nepal, then as now, is the poorest country on earth because it never had made those investments in infrastructure.
If we re-examine the relationship between luck and success, can that change how we view taxation?
I think it's very important to remain mindful that if you do succeed in life, you were very fortunate. You worked hard. Why did you work hard? Because you were born with a temperament or had parents who inculcated in you the cultural value of working hard. That's your good fortune if you end up in that bin rather than in the bin where you had a lazy temperament and weren't taught good values. So I think the whole business of how you think about your good fortune really does color how you feel about your responsibility to others who are less fortunate. Many people end up in dire straits in this life through absolutely no fault of their own. Most of the bankruptcies filed in this country are due to medical misfortune. That's not something that anybody can really avoid. You can eat well and exercise, but even people who do all those things often fall ill and are wiped out financially.
Flax is just one crop, but it can provide us with food, feed, and fuel. Because of its versatility, John Dwyer says it may be the answer to the global food versus fuel debate. And joining us now for more on that is John Dwyer. He's the CEO of Flax Energy, and it's nice to have you here at TVO.
Great to be here.
Okay, we're going to start from first principles here,
Sure.
okay? Flax is what?
Flax is what we call a cash crop, an agricultural oil seed. You can think about flax in the same family as canola or hemp seed or peanuts, peanut oil, all of these items that have a high oil yield.
And it's grown where?
In Canada. Canada does 56% of the world's flax. We're the largest growers in the world. I'm sure not a lot of people know that.
What provinces?
Mostly in the prairies. My company and the group of rabble-rousers I do business with are trying to get more and more farmers here in Ontario to grow flax. It's a fantastic crop, and we think it serves a far greater utility not only to the land but the people and the animals that eat it.
Is it mostly a food or a fuel?
It's both.
It's both.
That's the important component.
There are a lot of renewable energy sources that we're looking at right now in Ontario, obviously, from the sun to the wind to whatever else. What separates flax from all of them?
We don't want government money.
That's the biggest difference.
Well, I mean, that's one of them. I think there's three components that we see as this recurring theme in renewables. One, it's subsidized by the government. Two, it costs more than non-renewable products. And number three, it changes the way in which consumers consume. We're asking people to change their habits. If we really want something to be sustainable, it has to mimic the item it's replacing. And our business is fundamentally predicated on the economics of oil. You take 1 liter of oil, you make gasoline and diesel. You also make plastics, rubber, synthetics, adhesives, epoxies, cosmetics.
Is very versatile, isn't it?
It's probably the best economic model in the history of the modern competition market.
But not great for pollution.
Exactly. So what do? Find a product that replaces the negative connotations of oil, but mimics the economic components
Meaning
of it.
it can do all these different things, not just one thing.
Exactly. One input, multiple outputs.
And you think flax is that?
We think flax is but one small input in what we are coining now the new industrial revolution. We're trying to encourage folks of all ranges, whether it be a young entrepreneur or somebody who's retiring from the bank or in any range, to look at not just gasoline and diesel in replacing oil, but the plastics and the rubbers and the synthetics.
Do you think that flax can actually replace oil doing
No.
all those different things? It can't.
No, it cannot. It's not.
How much of a dent can it make?
Well, I think that's a question that relies on the fact that oil is finite, but we still don't know how much of it is left.
Joining us now is Kara Clearman. She is the president and CEO of Plug and Drive Ontario. And we welcome you to TVO.
Thank you so much,
Well,
Steve.
let's just start there. What's Plug and Drive Ontario?
So Plug and Drive is a nonprofit organization, and our goal is to accelerate the adoption of electric vehicles. And really, we're doing this to promote their environmental and economic benefits.
Is this a group that people join?
No, we're sort of a public interest group. We're out there trying to educate people on the benefits of these cars and encourage them to buy them.
Do you see a day coming when people are actually going to be driving these cars and they will be the majority of the cars on the road and the gas station is going to be kind of a distant memory, that kind of thing?
Well, I'm super optimistic, so I certainly see that that's possible. And I think it really depends on availability of gas and gas prices. I mean, if we see a huge spike in gas prices, more people will be willing to give this technology a crack. And we do find, like, we do a lot of public education around this, and we do a lot of events. And when we do these ride and drive events, and we make it possible for people to drive these cars, they say, wow, this is just a great regular car. And so you just, in a way, have to get people to try it. And they say, this isn't some strange technology that's not for me yet. It's here now, it's ready. And so I see it, the infrastructure is there. It wouldn't take a lot to get there. I think it's really possible.
Give me a sense of the bottom line here, because I know, for example, I used to drive a minivan, $70 a week to fill it up usually. Now I spend $1 a night on electricity for the volt.
Fantastic.
So it's a big savings. But is that typical?
It is typical.
It is.
I would say I also drove a minivan, and I was spending about $120 in a month, and now I'm spending about $20. And so on average, our research shows the price tag to fuel an EV versus fueling a gas car is about 1/6.
You know, there have been lots of predictions over the years about how we were, all going to be on diesel by now, we were all going to be driving hydrogen-powered cars by now, or, any number of different scenarios.
Certainly.
Hasn't happened. What you've described today is another potential scenario, but it may not happen. If oil is, half as expensive a month from now, that will certainly delay the embracing of this new technology, would it not?
You could be right. I remain optimistic simply because ultimately carbon will be priced. It isn't priced right now. When carbon is priced, these things become even more economic than they are now. On top of that, when we have this issue of a surplus of electricity that we lose money on at night, there is a strong economic driver to encourage it in Ontario. And so I think, with the help of the province and the companies and groups like ours, we can encourage people to do it in a way that it won't go the way of the hydrogen car and the natural gas car.
Extolling the benefits of Canada's oil sands might be a tough sell for many people, but not for Rick George. The former Suncor CEO turned a faltering oil company into the darling of Canada's oil patch. And joining us now to challenge the oil sands critics and shed some light on Canada's future energy needs, here's Rick George, recently retired President and CEO for Suncor Energy and the author of Sunrise, Suncor, the Oil Sands, and the Future of Energy. And we're happy to welcome you into that chair here at TVO tonight.
Steve, I'm delighted to be here with you.
I want to start with just a little background because those of us of a certain age will remember the name Suncor, and not necessarily for wonderful reasons.
Right.
30 years ago, we owned a PCU, didn't we?
The Ontario government did, yep.
Right.
Absolutely.
Well, the Ontario taxpayers.
Yeah.
We owned a quarter of your company to buy a quote-unquote window on the oil world, right?
That's right.
How'd that go?
Well, they actually bought it, I think, in the middle of the 80s and sold it in 1992 and 93. It was one of those cases, Steve, where they bought high and sold low, which is obviously the opposite of what you want to do. But that's actually kind of what happened.
Did it make sense at the time for the government of Ontario to make that purchase, in your view?
Well, if you remember back, and I didn't live in Canada then, but the federal government was establishing Petro-Canada. And so I think it was just an offset to that in lots of ways, kind of from a political and from an economic viewpoint.
Now, in the early 90s when we sold that company, we sold it because the economy was terrible, we needed the money, et cetera, et cetera. Had we hung on to our shares, how would we have done?
Well, today the shares trade somewhere around $33, $34, and if you take back, the stock has split several times, it would be back at about $2 a share, $2.50 a share. The reason I know that is I still own some of those shares.
So we shouldn't have sold, is what you're saying. Had we hung on, we'd have been better off.
The timing is always important, isn't it?
Let's move on to find out why this was called once upon a time the unluckiest oil company in Canada. Why did people call it that?
Well, really it deals around this whole oil sands business, which has always been a big part of Suncor. And if you think about it, the first plant was put in, which was the Suncor plant in 1967. For 25 years, it struggled to make a return above its cost of capital. So it was only in the 1990s, middle of the 1990s, that we used a bunch of technologies to get the cost of production down. Oil prices started to move up, and then we started to have a margin you could actually work with. That also meant a lot of other players came into the oil sands about the same time.
And you took a company that was doing $1 billion of business when you got there, and by the time you left, you were up to 50 billion.
Yeah, market cap. That's right, exactly.
Okay, you want to give us a, sort of the bullet points on how you managed to turn that around?
Well, it's detailed in my book, but obviously it's a work by a lot of hard people. No single individual does everything, right? And so I just was very lucky to lead a very good, talented group of people. And we make some really big bets at the right time.
What was the biggest bet?
The biggest bet was actually Project Millennium, which we decided to double the size of the plant in 1998. And crude was at $12 a barrel. And if you remember, the Economist had a front page that said crude was going to $5 a barrel. We made the decision on a $2 billion project that ended up to be about $3.4 billion at the end of the day. But the bet paid off big time for our shareholders.
You bet on cycles, right? You just assumed it was going to go triple digits at some point.
It's very important when you're in a cyclic industry to understand the cycles and to actually understand that a lot of times your best bets are made right at the bottom of the cycle. Usually your worst decisions are made at the top of the cycle.
One viewer disagreed about whether or not the underrepresentation of women on the air was a problem. So we got this tweet. If more women wanted to participate in media, he writes, they would. Maybe it's for the same reason fewer participate in politics, engineering, etc. It's a lack of interest. So why create a problem where there isn't one? If they don't want on, they don't want on. Sherry, the gist here is there's no barrier to participation. It's up to you. What do you think?
Well, so on some level, that's the raison d'etre of informed opinions. And that is to say to women, if we want to be at the decision-making table in our society, if we want our priorities and realities to be reflected, we need to step up to the plate. We need to stop saying I'm not the best person. So that underlies in part right. What I'm doing. But to suggest that women don't want to be at the table, we don't want to be part of the discussion, is flat out wrong. And I think it's just a question of a number of complex issues that we've already talked about, that women take longer to formulate and think about, and then they want to weigh in, but they want to do so in a slightly different way than is considered the norm. I have this classic story. My partner and I were walking across the parking lot of a Catholic church in Montreal on the day the Pope died, and a TV crew approached us and said, would you like to comment? And I said,
Pope John Paul II?
Yes,
okay.
5 years ago, whatever. I said, no, I don't think so, and kept walking. And David, who hadn't been to church in 40 years, said, sure, I'll comment. and I turned around stunned, and he solemnly declared, it's a sad day for Catholics everywhere. and as we continued walking, I looked at him and said, well, duh. And then I said, but wouldn't it be great if the next pope were to come up with a progressive policy on contraception that wouldn't disenfranchise the lives of millions of impoverished women around the world? Wouldn't that have been worth saying? But I had turned down the interview.
You turned down the chance to say that, and he did not
turn
down the chance to say it.
He got on the national news. He got on the national news.
By saying it's a sad day for Catholics.
Yeah, and nobody heard my provocative statement, which might have led to many other conversations.
Can I suggest you're making this poster's point, which is there was no barrier to participation for you.
That's right.
You opted out.
I did opt out, and that's why I run Informed Opinions, to encourage women not to opt out.
We all know that women opt out. We all have the experience of that. My concern is that that will become a cop-out. It will become a cop-out for men who are assigning, who are planning these kind of roundtables to sort of say, well, you know, they're going to say no anyway, so we don't really have to go the extra, whatever steps we need to go to try and get a balanced panel. And, you know, public discourse depends on having a diversity of voices. As you say, it's not just middle-aged men, it has to be women, it has to be people from diverse populations. We all need to be at the table.
Armin.
I actually think the poster got it right on, and I agree completely with you and you, because I think what this show is doing is forcing us to confront why that is. Why do women, when they want to not be on, don't want to be on? And if we don't talk about it, then we don't get to kind of like lift the rug and find that there's an elephant underneath it. And then how do you get that elephant out of the room? So I think your show is doing a great service, but so do comments like that, to make us kind of confront the unvarnished reality that a lot of women do just step back and they don't want to play. So why is that? Thank you.
Jordan.
Well, I'd also like to take issue with the idea that we need a diverse range of faces at the table. I don't
want to take issue with that?
Absolutely.
Why?
Because what you need is a diverse range of ideas at the table. And one of the least, well, I think so, yes. I think that one of the least sexist and gender prejudiced things you can say is that people should be judged by what they say and not who they are.
Yes, but there's this growing body of research literature documenting the extent to which any given group, if it's homogenous, will come up with fewer great ideas or solutions than a group that's heterogeneous.
Right, but it depends on how you define heterogeneous. There's more difference between individuals than there is between groups.
That may be
and that's one of the actual hallmarks. Like, if you want to push hard and figure out why people shouldn't be racist or sexist, the reason is because there's more difference within groups than there is between them. And if there's more difference within groups than between them, then it doesn't matter the face of the person who's having the opinion.
It's passing strange that somebody has so eloquently described why we are, as animals, responding the way we are, that you don't understand that as animals, if we don't see ourselves reflected, we figure we're not part of that pack. So seeing diversity is almost as important as hearing diversity. In fact, it might be an equally important portal into a discussion and why you want visual diversity.
It depends on whether you identify with your gender or your ideas.
No, and I don't disagree with you, but one of the portals into a discussion of feeling like my voice might count because I look like that person, especially when you're talking to young people. Especially when you're talking to young people.
Is that a male-female difference?
Well, no, I'm just wondering that it isn't part of your unpacking the story because while I couldn't agree with you more that it's important to have a very rich diversity of ideas, and I couldn't agree with you more that you get an even bigger richness by bringing in very unusual types of suspects, you get more people willing to voice their opinion if they feel like that tribe over there that's discussing it is not so foreign to me that I can't ever imagine myself there.
If that's the case, then why do the networks still have so much trouble attracting women?
But that's what we're discussing. And
I know, but the thing is,
I don't think for example, I don't think I get invited because I'm a woman. I might for TV because you can see the diversity. I might for radio, I don't know. But I don't know that at this stage in my life it's because I'm a woman. It might have been the dancing bear effect might have been in full bore the reason I was cast on debates early in my career. It's not now. It's because of the ideas I bring to the table. So I agree with you, but I think part of it is we got to mix it up here, folks. Visually, we got to mix it up. We got to make it look like we're playing to our audience, so the people watching.
No, we don't have to make it look like we are. I don't agree with that. I think that you actually have to do that. And you can't have it both ways. You can't say that there's more difference within groups than between groups and then say it's equally important to have multiple group representation. You have to have one of those or the other because they're not the same.
Let me go at you. Can I go at you on this a little bit?
Sure.
We've only got 2 minutes left here, but you got a daughter.
Yeah.
How can you want to have your daughter turn on television every night and see only male economists, only male academics, only male journalists?
No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that the selection process should be blind as to the group. And when we're talking about diversity, which is specifically what we were talking about, that what we should be talking about is diversity of ideas. And I also would say that you guys do that particularly well.
It can only be about diversity of ideas. It shouldn't be about diversity of how it looks, that it reflects the society it purports to serve.
I think you go after diversity of ideas and you let the cards fall where they're going to. And
I hear you saying two different things. Yeah. I hear you saying it matters and then you're saying it doesn't matter. And if it matters for your daughter to see women, but it doesn't matter for a black mother's son to see himself portrayed, a young person that's black portrayed on TV or any other group that you would want. I don't see how those things are, it doesn't seem internally coherent to me.
I don't know what
because you're making the distinction between diversity, which I imagine you mean skin color, and male-female differences. But differences are differences. There are men and women, and there are people with every imaginable color of skin in this city, in this province, and you would hope that everybody sees some pathway into the conversation because they recognize themselves.
I've got 20 seconds left.
I was just going to say that the underlying life experiences of that diversity, those women, those racialized minorities, those people of different abilities, their life experiences will necessarily inform different ideas.
That's what people say, yes, but I don't believe that that's the case.
The research suggests it does.
This is one of the few times when I wish we had more than an hour. Well done, everybody. That was a great discussion tonight. Thanks so much to Sherry Graydon, founder of Informed Opinions, Kathy English, the public editor of the Toronto Star, Armin Yalnizyan from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, Jordan Peterson, the professor of psychology at the University of Toronto. Well done, gang. And that is the Agenda's Week in Review. You can see all of those programs in their entirety. They're on our website, theagenda.tvo.org. You can find them on our iTunes channel or on our YouTube channel, and that's youtube.com/theagenda.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.